don't put too much stress on your first kiss. It'll happen, but like it gets better, more funnier, and like
Yeah. And it only gets magical if you're actually in love with the person, like later on, after you've kissed them a lot. But usually the first kiss.
True. I prefer women, but I want a guy to force himself on me. I am open to trans women doing the same, but I don't see too many of them wanting. Oh, some of them do like work off the side because like some of them are actually sex workers. So like there's never a shortage for someone to take a nice 40-year-old hairy man aside and take him. just really take him.
Is one last kiss, but she won't let me have it. I want to get over her, but I can't. I need help. Hey, this is Morgan Rector. Join me and my co-host Rosanna Chilton for the Confession Post podcast. ConfessionPost.com is a website where users post highly personal content anonymously for the reading pleasure of other users. On this podcast, Rosanna and I read confessions from the site and give our analysis. You can listen to the Confession Post podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Rachel Telfor.
And I'm Michelle Gower.
We are the hosts of a new true crime podcast.
It is called Children of the Void.
The Void refers to children who are missing.
And children who have died under mysterious and suspicious circumstances.
Sometimes parents know nothing about what has happened to their child.
And sometimes they seem to know more than they let on.
Like Casey Anthony.
And the John Benet Ramsey case.
We are determined to do our part to find missing children.
And the truth when the story of their disappearance doesn't hold up.
Together, we will blast the shadows with light so that no more children disappear into the void.
Children of the Void debuts in September.
Join us so we can all make a difference.
Please subscribe.
Until then, I'm Rachel Telfor.
And I'm Michelle Gower.
You can catch Children of the Void on Apple, Spotify, YouTube,
and everywhere else you get your podcasts.
Hey y'all, Morgan Rector here. Do you have an idea for a podcast? Furthermore, would you like to host and co-produce your own podcast? I am always looking to expand the portfolio of my company, Leader One Podcast Network. If you would like to have your own show, send me an email and we can talk about it. Aside from politics and religion, I'm open to just about any topic. If you are passionate, knowledgeable, and articulate, I want to talk to you. You can contact me by email, morgansvariety@gmail.com. I hope to hear from you soon. Hey, Morgan Rector here. I'm just dropping a line to say thank you to all of my Patreon donors. Since I'm not a Joe Rogan or Mark Maron, podcasting is more or less a starving artist gig for guys like me. Patreon donations keep me from having to take a job that would take away from my ability to generate more Human Monsters content. The website URL for Patreon is www.patreon, that's spelled patreon.com/leader ONE, Leader One. A way to make a one-time donation is to send it through PayPal at Morgan Rector 331, Rector spelled RECTOR, at hotmail.com, morganrector331 at hotmail.com. You don't have to give a large amount of money if it isn't possible. If $1 a month or $1 one time is the best you can pony up, it would be gratefully accepted. I know how hard things are for everybody during COVID. Thank you for all the support you have given the show, whether it is through financial donations or simply by listening. I am grateful for all you have given to me and the program. Enjoy the show. Welcome to Human Monsters. Though there has been some debate about the birthplace and birth dates of the Harpe brothers, with some claiming they were born in Scotland, others insist they were born in the wilderness of North Carolina. Micaiah Big Harpe was estimated to have been born between 1748 and 1767. Some sources say the former was more likely the most accurate date given. He was a tower of a man, with a height of at least 6 feet, and filled out with muscular bulk. He was said to have come across with first impressions bearing, quote, an ill-looking, downcast countenance, end quote. He had no time for common human decency, and even less regard for human life. The blend of these ingredients amounted to a very dangerous man. Wiley Harp, who was also known by the nicknames Little and Red-Headed, was born between 1750 and 1769. Though he was younger than his brother, he was so haggard in appearance that he looked years older than Micaiah. He also came across with a so-called downcast countenance. More data regarding the brothers' origins is clouded. It is strongly suggested that they were born in Orange County, North Carolina. While most available information asserts that they were brothers, some historians argue that they were first cousins named Joshua and William Harper, who were born in Scotland in 1759 or 1760. It is most commonly believed that they were brothers. Their father was loyal to the British king. He served in a Troy militia and fought against the family's neighbors during the Regulator War between 1765 and 1771. The Regulator War consisted of an effort of the North Carolina colonists to end the meddling of the Crown in their affairs. They failed, but the Regulator War became a precursor to the American Revolution. Following the Regulator War, the Harpe brothers' neighbors treated the Harpes like second-class citizens. The Harpe brothers were farmers of produce, but that did not feature in their long-range plans. They had what they considered to be real careers as their dreams. What they really wanted to do was start a large plantation and oversee a workforce of slaves. North Carolina didn't present much opportunity to live out this dream at the time, so they moved to Virginia. There weren't any opportunities to oversee slaves in Virginia, so they made their way back to North Carolina. During the American Revolution, the Harpe brothers sided with the British Crown. They fought gallantly. The truth about their role in the bloodshed was that it had nothing to do with loyalty to the motherland. They just wanted to exact revenge against their neighbors. As time would tell, this consisted of burning down farms, raping their women, and pillaging whatever valuables they could get their hands on. It wasn't long into the Revolution that they joined a pro-British group called a rape gang. They would target Patriot citizens for rape, theft, and murder. They would also burn and destroy property. They were terrorists, intent on intimidating Patriot farmers who were not protected. By doing this, they disrupted food production that would have benefited Washington's army. The rape gangs didn't go about their business unopposed. The Patriots would contend with them when possible. Once in North Carolina, one Captain James Wood had an encounter with the Harpe rape gang. The gang had kidnapped, tortured, and raped 3 girls. Wiley Harp was in the process of raping a 4th girl during Wood's arrival. Wood shot Wiley, leaving him wounded, though not critically. Wiley released the girl, and she ran off. Wiley survived the shooting and vowed that he would get his revenge against Wood. The Harpe rape gang disbanded in 1780. The Harps joined a group of military associators that were serving under the Crown. They were not members of the British Army. In a way, they were more loyal to the Crown than anybody who fought for England in an official capacity. The British didn't provide them with uniforms, arms, and pay. That didn't stop the associators. They subsisted by foraging in the woods, robbing anybody they could when civilization emerged within the trees, and looting battlefields. The only difference between them and the rape gangs was that they were regularly involved in military engagements. Captain Wood's son Frank served as a militiaman with a contingent known as the Over Mountain Men. He had a younger sister named Susan, aka Susanna Wood. The Harps kidnapped her, and she became Micaiah's wife. Frank Wood observed as the Harp brothers took part in the Battle of Kings Mountain in October 1780. They fought for the British as usual. The Harps fought as part of a militia that was commanded by British Major Patrick Ferguson. It was a 3-hour battle, and Frank Wood was most intent on killing Micaiah Harp. He was unable to land the fatal shot. The Harps went on to serve under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Banastre Tarleton at the battles of Blackstock's Farm and Cowpens in January 1781. The Harps had an appetite for flesh and blood, and it was for the human variety. They began killing in earnest in East Tennessee. There were several settlements in the state, but they were sparse and separated by vast distances. It was rugged country. The human population were fiercely independent, hardy, crude, and strong, able to bounce back from any kind of hardship. They had to be. The landscape was very unforgiving, and they would only survive if they were tough. Because the population of humans was so low, there was more than enough wild game, fresh water, and soil for agriculture. The winters could be rough, especially on dirt farms, and famine always came knocking at the door when the climate was especially merciless. Anybody who thought they were above eating rabbit and deer meat risked dying of pride. Cabin fires were another commonality, due to pioneer families leaving too much soot in a chimney flue or a spark landing in an inopportune spot. As far as feral animals were concerned, they posed a danger of their own. There were bears, large cats, and poisonous snakes on the prowl. Medical care was hard to come by, so anybody who suffered any of these environmental inflictions wasn't long for this earth. Even stampeding buffalo posed an occasional peril, and they soon learned to stay out of their way. They also entered into skirmishes with Native Americans, which often resulted in deaths going either way. They could cope with most threats, but serial killers they had never considered. To murder for reasons that were unrelated to political ideals or self-defense against an aggressor was unheard of. Indeed, the people who occupied the so-called New West were unprepared for the likes of the Harp brothers and their crimes. As one outsider noted, neither avarice nor want, nor any of the usual inducements to the commission of crime seemed to govern their conduct. A savage thirst for blood, a deep-rooted enmity against human nature, could alone be discovered in their actions. Plunder was not their object. They took only what would have been freely given them, and no more than what was necessary to supply the immediate wants of nature. They destroyed without having suffered injury, and without the prospect of benefit. Mounted on fine horses, they plunged into the forest, eluded pursuit by frequently changing their course, and appeared unexpectedly to perpetrate new horrors, at points distant from those where they were supposed to lurk. The Harps rendered such disgusting human depravity and barbarism, and a total disregard of the morals of the community. However, it may be regretted that such monsters as the Harps ever should have existed to disgrace humanity, yet it is an incontrovertible fact. The Harps delighted in victimizing their neighbors, especially when they were incapable of defending themselves. Eventually, the Harps came to resent the restrictions that were placed on them by the Crown. To break free from the restraints, they made their way across the mountains, where they could be free to do as they pleased. Wiley Harp was still obsessed with taking vengeance on Captain Wood. It was then that they kidnapped Susan and a girl named Maria Davidson. Speculation has it that the girls may have been sisters. The Harp brothers declared that the girls were their wives, though Micaiah took possession of them both. Both women bore his children. Micaiah was indifferent to the strictures of matrimony, however, and he didn't object when Wiley raped the girls. The Harps migrated with their wives and 4 other men into the settlement that would become Tennessee. One of the 4 men was Moses Doss. He expressed sympathy for the women, as any fool could see that they were being abused. Micaiah repaid his concern by murdering him and leaving him in the woods. 1781. The band joined and lived among the Chickamauga Cherokee. They didn't abandon their violent ways. On April 2nd, they joined a war party of 400 Chickamauga, whose leader was Chief Dragging Canoe, against a patriot frontier settlement of Bluff Station at Fort Nashboro, what is now known as Nashville. The skirmish came to be known as the Battle of the Bluffs. The settlers held their own against Dragging Canoe's warriors and were successful in repelling them. August 19th, 1782. The Harps were members of the Chickamauga Cherokee War Party that ventured to Kentucky. They were supported by the British. They engaged an army of patriot pioneers led by Daniel Boone at the Battle of Blue Licks. They emerged victorious. The Harps fought alongside the Chickamauga Cherokee in other battles, but none of them affected the outcome of the Revolution. The Harps spent about a dozen years with the Chickamauga Cherokee at a village southwest of what is now known as Chattanooga called Nickajack. Nickajack proved to be an ideal location for the Harp brothers to engage in criminal activity. The inhumane brutality they visited upon others continued in this locale. Legend has it that both of Micaiah's wives gave birth to children at Nickajack and that he killed all 4 infants. They fought with the Chickamauga Cherokee when it benefited them in some way, like when they attacked the neighbors who shamed and marginalized them. Otherwise, they were happy to terrorize anyway, regardless of origin or skin color. They learned about barbarity from the Renegades and Troy rape gang during the war. They also knew how to defend themselves and stay safe. They never let their guards down. They would keep their tomahawks and knives by their sides, even while they slept. They never ventured from the camp without weapons. They even conveyed to their allies that they would slaughter anyone who crossed or so much as threatened them. Their renegade allies were impressed that they enjoyed roughing it like feral animals. They also delighted in the fact that they derived enjoyment from committing murder. Both men and women of the Harp clan wore leather hunting shirts. Their feet were shod in moccasins made from the hides of the animals they felled. They never tanned their hides, which was customary among Native American tribes. They only wore hats on the coldest of winter days, and those hats were also made of deerskin hides sewn together. The Harps frequently used aliases when introduced to strangers, which kept the law off their trail. The government, newly formed, decreed that anyone who provided aid to renegades were outlaws. Nevertheless, the Harps maintained friendly ties with some of the white settlers near Nickajack. In September 1704, the American government decided it was time to use force against the denizens of Nickajack. They organized a major military assault. The Harps managed to catch wind of it just in time, and they fled. Instead, the American militiamen killed all the villagers, effectively wiping Nickajack off the map. The Harps were not willing to return to their former lives as common farm workers. Crime was their profession now. They would strike against the frontier settlers. They robbed and killed with impunity for many years. They robbed people who lived a few miles from Nickajack for 9 months. From there, they drifted northeast to Powell's Valley, which is located near Knoxville. They resumed their careers as outlaws. They stole food and other necessities. They would nick any money that settlers may have had. There was very little in the way of law enforcement, and the Harps established a reputation as ruthless, aggressive killers by then, so nobody stood in their way. The only man known to have been released unscathed was a minister they encountered, who was traveling alone. They confiscated his pistol. Their brief meeting ended with them giving back everything they pilfered. They wanted him to remember them as he regaled others with the story of their encounter. At that time, Knoxville was known as a town that was teeming with criminals and other lowlifes. To quote James Weir, who visited during what was known at the time as County Court Day, he said the town was confused with a promiscuous throng of every denomination. Some talked, some sang, and mostly all did profanely swear. Weir was shocked by hearing, quote, the horrid oaths and dreadful indignities offered to the supreme governor of the universe, who with one frown is able to shake them into non-existence. Weir was appalled that Knoxville didn't abide by the so-called blue laws, which closely govern behavior. He was disgusted that municipal leaders in Knoxville allowed the citizens to engage in, quote, dancing, singing, and playing of cards, etc., unquote, including on Sundays. Weir concurred with a citizen of Knoxville that the devil has grown so old that it renders him incapable of traveling, and that he is taken up in Knoxville, and there hopes to spend the remaining part of his days in tranquility, as he believes he is among his friends. The Harp brothers moved near Knoxville because it provided a larger cache of victims than the wilderness from whence they came. They built a log cabin and planted crops, coming across like a typical pioneer family. Eventually, Wiley found a woman his brother didn't monopolize. He courted Sarah Rice, better known as Sally. Her father was a reverend, but Wiley fooled him into thinking he was a pious and moral character. The Harps made money by selling butchered meat. It struck people who knew them as odd. The Harps didn't raise livestock. The villagers concluded that they were stealing animals from their neighbors. This wasn't the only behavior that drew disapproval from the people of Knoxville. They drank to excess. They gambled. They got into fights. The people of Knoxville came to view them as pests. Another problem the brothers brought to the area was arson. Houses, barns, and stables were set afire. There was initially no evidence that the Harps were responsible, but given their other behavior, they were considered highly suspect. One day a man named Edward Teal discovered that several of his best horses had been stolen. Though there was no evidence to substantiate his suspicions, he decided that the Harps must be the perpetrators. He would not take it lying down. He gathered a posse together, and they went to the Harps' cabin. The Harps were not home. They never returned. There was evidence that horses had been tied up near the cabin, so Teal and his posse continued pursuing the Harps. They pursued them across the Clinch River and into the Cumberland Mountains. They found the thieves, and to their surprise, the Harp brothers surrendered without incident. Teal and his posse brought the Harps back to town to stand trial. 5 miles northeast of Knoxville, the Harps ran off, and Teal could not find them. He let them go. He was happy to have his horses back. The Harps were now fugitives on the run. They were used to it. The night they escaped from the clutches of Teal's reconnaissance team, they went to an inn west of Knoxville called Hughes's Rowdy Groggery. Hughes, 2 of his brothers-in-law by the name of Metcalf, and a man named Johnson from Jefferson County, Tennessee, were present. The Harps were immediately recognized when they entered the place. Johnson was never seen alive after that night. A few days later, his body was found floating in the Holstein River. Not only had he been murdered, but he was mutilated. The sight was horrifying for everybody who had a look. Not only had the Harp brothers killed him, but they urinated on his corpse. They ripped open his chest cavity and filled it with rocks to weigh it down. They dumped him in the water in hopes he would sink like a stone. After a while, the rocks became displaced, and the corpse, with decay well underway, floated to the surface. Hughes and the Metcalf brothers reported to police what happened the night of the Johnsons' disappearance. They said they felt strongly that the Harps were responsible for the murder. The authorities were skeptical. Hughes was not perceived as a man of high moral standing. Hughes and the Metcalf brothers were arrested for the killing and sent to jail. A jury acquitted them, much to the dismay of local citizenry. The Metcalf brothers fled the area. Hughes refused to be intimidated. One day when he was at the Rowdy Groggery, a group of regulators bound him, whipped him, and tore his home apart. They eventually drove him away from East Tennessee. The Harp brothers traveled to Western Virginia. They entered Kentucky in December 1798. Kentucky had an unsavory reputation at the time. It had the nickname Dark and Bloody Ground. It would get even bloodier during the Harps' stay. Their first murder was a victim named Peyton. They took his horse and several of his possessions. Their next victims were 2 men named Bates and Paca. They agreed to travel with the Harps and set up camp as soon as they found a suitable location. Once it was dark, Micaiah advanced toward Bates from behind. Wiley did the same with Paca. They shot both men. Paca survived his first shot, but Micaiah finished him off. He split his head open with his tomahawk. They stole all of Bates and Paca's belongings and continued through the forest. Stephen Langford and his traveling companion, David Irby, were venturing toward the Cumberland Gap. They separated, agreeing to reunite at Frankfort, Kentucky. On December 12, 1798, Langford stopped at a public house near the Big Rockcastle River. He decided to spend the night there. The next morning, he awaited his breakfast when the Harp brothers came in. Being naive and a poor judge of character, he offered the Harp clan a meal, paying for it himself. When the Harp men saw the silver dollars Langford paid with, they became friendlier, asking him if he would travel with them. He agreed and was never seen again. He was found by cowpokes a few days later. His body had been discarded in the woods. It had been egregiously wounded. December 1798. Captain Joseph Ballinger received a request from Kentucky's Attorney General John Blair. He asked Ballinger to assemble a posse for the purpose of pursuing the Harps and bringing them to justice. Ballinger gave his word to Blair that he would accomplish this task. The Harps migrated into western Kentucky's wilderness. They believed they had concealed Stephen Langford's body effectively, nulling the possibility that he would be found. Meanwhile, an old friend of Langford confirmed his identity when the coroner allowed him to examine his remains. The Harps were so sure of their ability to cover their tracks that they took their time as they made their way west. December 25th, 1798. Ballinger's posse caught up with the Harps near a place known as Carpenter's Station, which was 8 miles southwest of Stanford. The Harps were at ease, sitting on a log without a care in the world. Ballinger commanded his men to rush them. The Harps were outnumbered, outgunned, and were unable to flee on their horses. They surrendered without incident. When they searched the Harps, they found several items that had belonged to Stephen Langford, including a pocketbook with Langford's name written in it. The Harps were taken to Logan County Jail. The jail was a log cabin containing 2 cells measured at 12 feet square. Both the men and women were incarcerated. They were segregated by gender. The Ballinger posse was satisfied that they had done their duty, and they dispersed to their private quarters, leaving the rest to the police and the courts. January 4th, 1799. 10 days after their arrest, the Harps faced a hearing of 3 judges. The stated charges brought against them were feloniously and of their malice aforethought, murdering and robbing a certain Thomas Langford on Wednesday the 12th day of December 1798 on the road leading from Kentucky to Virginia through the wilderness. The hearing was well attended, as the Harps had become quite notorious by then. It was commonly assumed that the county sheriff would hang the Harps and their women. All of the women were pregnant at the time of their arrest, and all 3 of them delivered their babies during their incarceration. All the defendants entered pleas of not guilty. They declined the opportunity to speak in their defense. 5 witnesses were called by the prosecuting attorneys to testify against the Harps. Captain Ballinger was the first. He described how he and his men chased and captured the Harps. He also described finding items that had belonged to Stephen Langford. David Irby noted that the pocketbook that was found among the Harps' belongings had belonged to Langford. John Ferris Sr. testified, confirming what was recounted regarding what happened at his public house involving Langford and the Harps. His wife, Jane Ferris, also confirmed that the Harps had items on their person that belonged to Stephen Langford. Thomas Welsh affirmed everything that Captain Ballinger said. The Harps took a stab at defending themselves, but were ineffective at doing so. The judges rendered their decision. Their ruling was that the Harps, quote, ought to be tried for the murder of Langford before the judges of the district court, holden for the Danville district at the next April term, and it is ordered that they be remanded to jail. The Harps were escorted to the Danville jail on January 5th. Micaiah Harpe was not intimidated by his jailers. He offered to fist fight whomever the two best fighting men in Kentucky happened to be if the jailer agreed to release him as a reward for victory. Should he lose, he would accept the ruling of the court. The Harpe brothers had no intention of waiting for the court to convict and hang them. They fully intended to escape at the first opportunity. Their jailer, a man known as Bigler, bought 2 horse locks to chain the men's feet to the ground. He knew it would be foolhardy to underestimate the Harpe brothers. He also installed a lock on the front jail door. 2 weeks later, he purchased 3 pounds of nails to further secure the facility against any possibility of escape. 4 men were hired to guard the prisoners. March 16th. Despite all the provisions that were put into place to ensure the Harpe brothers' confinement, they managed to escape through a hole they bored in the wall. They left the women and children behind. They grabbed 2 of the guards' rifles on their way out. Bigler resigned after this incident. It was rumored that he was bribed by the Harpes to facilitate their getaway. It was never proven, however. The available evidence was insufficient. Having left the community dissatisfied with the efforts to bring the Harpes to justice, the court decided to placate them by putting the women on trial. Betsy Harpe delivered a son on February 7, 1799. Susan Harpe gave birth to a girl on March 6th. Both women were provided with the services of a midwife and refreshments to help them regain their strength after giving birth. Sally Harpe gave birth to a girl on April 8th. She was not only provided with a midwife, but she was given whiskey to help her cope with the difficulties of giving birth. All 3 women were accused of murdering Stephen Langford. Their trials were scheduled for April 17th and 18th. Susan was found guilty on April 17th. On the 18th, Betsy was found not guilty. Sally was acquitted. The citizens of Danville commonly believed that the only silver lining of the Langford murder was that it liberated Susan, Sally, and Betsy from the clutches of their husbands. The women did not harbor ill will toward the people of Kentucky. All they wanted was to return to Knoxville with their children and live lives of peace and normalcy. Feeling sympathy for the women because of what they had been through, many locals collected donations for them. Money, clothing, and a horse were collected, and the women left in pursuit of a better life. A few days after the Harpe brothers escaped from jail, some travelers from Maryland were found murdered. Their bodies were already decomposing when they were discovered. The savagery with which they were dispatched led the locals to assume that only the Harpes could be responsible. They called for their executions so that they could not strike again. On March 28th, W.E. Strong, Justice of the Peace for Mercer County, issued an order that instructed, quote, all sheriffs and constables to take and recommit the Harpe brothers. Citizens didn't have much faith in the local agents of law enforcement or the courts. After all, the Harpes managed to escape from a correctional facility that was better equipped than most to contain the men indefinitely. From the middle of March onwards, the local people assembled lynch mobs whose charge was to search for the Harpes and bring about an end to their killing spree, by any means necessary. Legal representatives did not approve of the lynch parties. Authorities in Tennessee were notified that the Harpe brothers might wander back into their state. Captain Joseph Ballinger pursued the Harpes without waiting for the consent of the governor. They found the Harpes by the headwaters of Rolling Fork. When Ballinger's men raised their rifles, the Harpes scattered, disappearing into the woods. They fled deep enough into the wilderness to avoid being captured. Ballinger was happy to include Henry Skaggs in his posse. Skaggs was a famous pioneer who discovered parts of Kentucky thereby unknown to other settlers. He was often referred to as, quote, a valiant man in battle and a great hunter, end quote. Skaggs was as eager to find the Harps as Ballinger was. He brought his hunting dogs with him. Another man who joined the posse was Colonel Daniel Trabue, a veteran of the Revolutionary War. When he agreed to join the posse, he was awaiting the return of his son, 13-year-old John. He had gone to a neighbor's house to borrow some flour and seed beans. He should have returned by then, and it became a concern. As Skaggs and Trabue talked, John's dog walked into the front yard. The dog was gravely injured. Trabue went to his neighbor's house and was informed that John had left his house hours ago. The entire community assisted in the search for John. Despite their efforts, days went by without a trace of him. Trabue began to fret, fearing that the Harp brothers got a hold of his son. A sign that the Harps had been in the area emerged 15 miles southwest of the Trabue farm, near the East Fork of the Barren River. They slaughtered a calf and made moccasins from its hide. They left their old moccasins behind. 2 weeks after John disappeared, his dead body was found accidentally. It had been severely mutilated. The Harps severed numerous parts of his corpse. They tossed what was left of his remains into a sinkhole. They took the flour with them. The people of Tennessee and Kentucky were unnerved now that they knew the Harp brothers would kill anyone, even a child. Even more chilling was the knowledge that what limited law enforcement that existed in the region was ineffective at containing the Harps. April 22nd, a committee appealed to the governor for assistance. He responded with a proclamation. By the governor, a proclamation. Whereas it has been represented to me that Micaiah Harp, alias Roberts, and Wiley Harp, alias Roberts, who were confined in the jail of the Danville district under a charge of murder, did on the 16th day of March last break out of the said jail. Whereas the ordinary methods of pursuit have been found ineffectual for apprehending and restoring to confinement the said fugitives, I have judged it necessary to the safety and welfare of the community and to the maintenance of justice to issue this my proclamation, and do hereby offer and promise a reward of $300 to any person who shall apprehend and deliver into the custody of the jailer of the Danville district the said Micaiah Harp, alias Roberts, and a like reward of $300 for apprehending and delivering, as aforesaid, the said Wiley Harp, alias Roberts, to be paid out of the public treasury agreeably to law. In testimony whereof I have hereunto set my hand, and have caused the seal of the Commonwealth to be affixed, done at Frankfort on the 22nd day of April, in the year of our Lord, 1799, and of the Commonwealth the 7th, L.S., by the Governor James Garrard, Harry Tolman, Secretary. This was the governor's description of the perpetrators. Micaiah Harp, alias Roberts, is about 6 feet high, of a robust make, and is about 30 or 32 years of age. He has an ill-looking, downcast countenance, and his hair is black and short, but comes very much down his forehead. He is built very straight, and is full-fleshed in the face. When he went away, he had on a striped nankeen coat, dark blue woolen stockings, leggings of drab cloth, and trousers of the same as the coat. Wiley Harp, alias Roberts, is very meager in his face, has short black hair but not quite so curly as his brother's. He looks older, though really younger, and has likewise a downcast countenance. He had on a coat of the same stuff as his brother's, and had a drab, surt-out coat over the close-bodied one. His stockings were dark blue woolen ones, and his leggings of drab cloth. His appearance was too striking not to rivet attention. In size, he towered above the ordinary stature. His frame was bony and muscular, his breast broad, his limbs gigantic. Others were struck by Micaiah's eyes. The eye was fearless and steady, but it was also artful and audacious, glaring upon the beholder with an unpleasant fixedness and brilliancy, like that of a ravenous animal gloating upon its prey, and concentrating all its malignity into one fearful glance. Wiley Harp was armed. He carried a rifle, powder horn, and a pouch of the backwoodsman. He tied a broad leather belt around his waist, inside of which were 2 knives, one large and one small. He still carried a tomahawk. Micaiah was usually disheveled, a recollection regarding his clothes. His clothing was uncouth and shabby, his exterior weather-beaten and dirty, indicating continual exposure to the elements, and pointing out this singular person as one who dwelt far from the habitations of men and who mingled not in the courtesies of civilized life. His hair was matted and uncombed. Speaking conclusively of his character, one quote summed him up thusly: "He was some desperate outlaw, an unnatural enemy of his species, destitute of the nobler sympathies of human nature, and prepared at all points for assault or defense." The governor's description of Wiley Harp consisted of the following observations. Wiley was somewhat under common size, had red hair, blue eyes, and a handsome look, but having the same suspicious exterior, his countenance equally fierce and sinister. Before news of the men's travels spread across every region of Kentucky, the Harps had murdered a man named Dooley in Metcalfe County. They left another corpse behind by the name of Stump. He was murdered by the Barren River. Stump went to welcome the men to the settlement. He approached them with fiddle in hand. Such was the extent of his southern hospitality. Unfortunately for Stump, there was no amount of kindness that would charm the Harps into sparing anyone's life. Both men beat and stabbed Stump, ushering him into death slowly and painfully. Assured of Stump's demise, they cut open his chest cavity, filled it with heavy rocks, and tossed Stump's body into the river. The local sheriff concluded that the Harps were responsible. Their calling card of cutting open chests to weigh down the corpses in bodies of water was unmistakable. The Harps ventured to the settlement of Henderson, Kentucky. There they reunited with their women. They all moved to the banks of the Ohio River. The men committed several murders in the Green River country. 12 miles away from their arrival at Cave In Rock, they emerged in Illinois, close to the mouth of the Saline River. They stumbled upon 3 people who were sitting by a campfire. The Harps shot them all to death. Captain Ballinger had searched for the Harps, but due to an error that threw the search party off track, he resigned and returned home. Captain Young of Mercer County, Kentucky, organized a posse to purge the area of criminals. They promised blood for blood. Their stated mission was to exterminate the Harps and all other outlaws, or at least drive them out of the country. Along the way, they pushed other criminals out of the region. They also acquired more personnel. Captain Young declared them victorious at the conclusion of their mission, though their failure to find and execute the Harps was not overseen. Governor Garrard knew the Harps were just as dangerous as ever. He anticipated that they would return to Kentucky if they assumed that the Commonwealth gave up their pursuit. In June of 1799, Garrard deputed Alexander McFarland and brothers to contend with these inveterate enemies of human happiness, should they be found in any adjacent state. He hoped the average Kentuckian would remain vigilant enough to keep the Harps away. A man named Samuel Mason proclaimed himself the, quote, king of the river pirates, end quote. His gang was the scourge of cave-in rock. The Harps took up the task of raiding flatboats floating down the Ohio River. The Harps were driven away by the other outlaws in the area, who were keen to retain their share of the monopoly of the pirate trade in the area. As one author put it, this aggregation of outlaws was doubtless a depraved conglomeration of evildoers, but in the Harps they found two human brutes beyond even their toleration. Still, the Harps committed an act that shocked even the most hardened criminals in the area. A couple docked their boat so their companions could do some repairs. As this work was done, the couple went to a large rock to enjoy the view of the river. Soon the Harp brothers snuck up behind them and, in their warped view of things, played a prank. The so-called prank consisted of throwing the couple over a ledge. They fell 40 feet to the beach below. Remarkably, they didn't suffer serious injuries. The Harps bragged about their practical joke to the other outlaws, but the others didn't find it so amusing. Doing such a thing was likely to attract attention from law enforcement. This did not dissuade the Harps from inflicting needless torture on innocent people. Two families passing down the Ohio River on a flatboat landed at Smithland. There they would settle until they built new homes for themselves. They didn't get a chance to do that. The Harps launched their assault on them. The pioneers fought back, but they were no match for the brutality of the Harps. Most of the pioneers were murdered, but a few survivors were kept as captives and brought ashore. The Harps decided to have fun with their prisoners. They forced a man to remove all his clothes. They tied him to the top of a spooked horse and led it to the top of a cliff. The horse was blindfolded, and when the Harp brothers startled it, the horse leapt off the cliff, falling over 100 feet to the rocky shore beneath. This was another crime by which the other outlaws in the area were repulsed. Some of the pirates even contemplated killing the Harps. The Harp women persuaded Samuel Mason to spare them, concerned about their fate as widowed mothers with infants in need. Mason decided to spare their lives, but he ordered that they leave the area immediately. The Harps fled eastward to Tennessee. July 1799. A farmer named Bradbury was viciously murdered. The Harps were initially suspected of culpability. July 22nd. The Harps murdered Chesley Coffey. There are two theories about how the Harp brothers brought about Coffey's demise. One story had it that he was rounding up cattle late one afternoon when the Harps leapt out at him from the shadows, surprising, then killing him. They took his rifle and shoes before leaving his corpse under a tree. The other story was that young Coffey was riding along the road at night to procure a fiddle. This tale noted that the Harps smeared Coffey's brains on a tree because his horse ran him against the trunk. 2 days later, one William Ballard was the next unfortunate soul to cross paths with the Harps. As with some of their other victims, they cut open his chest and put stones in his body so that it would sink in the river. July 29th. They killed their next victims at a location called Brassel's Knob. Brothers James and Robert Brassel were traveling near their home. James walked, carried a rifle. Robert was unarmed and on horseback. The Harps approached the men and said, "What's the news?" They told them about the murders of William Ballard and the Coffee Boy. The Harps told them they not only knew about the murders, but were in pursuit of the killers. They said they were waiting for the rest of their posse. They asked them if they would like to join them. The Brussels were more than happy to get involved. Bakea grabbed James' rifle. He slammed it to the ground. He accused him and his brother of being the notorious Harps. He tied James' hands and feet together. James insisted he was innocent, but his protestations fell on deaf ears. Robert realized these men were the Harps. He jumped down from his horse and went after James' gun. He was unable to obtain it, and he ran into the woods. Wiley chased after him. He shot in his direction, but missed. Robert eventually ran into a man named Dale. He asked him to accompany him to where he left his brother. He told them he and his brother encountered the Harps. Dale reluctantly agreed to help. Dale neither had the firepower nor the cold-blooded capacity to kill that the Harps had, but he agreed to accompany Robert back to the site. When they arrived at the spot where Robert last saw his brother, they found James dead. James had been savagely beaten. His throat had been cut. His rifle was shattered beyond repair, leaving vengeance out of reach for his surviving brother. The Harps left tracks behind them that led to Knoxville. A few miles down the trail, they were shocked by the sight of the Harps headed toward them. They were armed and accompanied by their women. Mercifully, all the Harps did was shoot a dirty look at Robert before riding on. Pandemonium ensued in eastern Tennessee. Everybody was arming themselves for fear that the Harps would do them in. Even children were outfitted with weapons. Guns, knives, daggers, frying pans, anything that could be weaponized was used as arms. The trail of blood left by the Harp brothers continued as they killed John Tully, a resident of Kentucky. He was found near a road. He had been murdered and hidden underneath a log. The motive for this killing was a little harder to understand. Tully had provided assistance to the Harp brothers by notifying them where the law was in hot pursuit. Ultimately, he suffered the same fate as anybody else who showed generosity and assistance to the Harps. Loyalty meant nothing to them. Colonel Trabue ordered a man named John Ellis to travel to Henderson and notify General Samuel Hopkins that the Harp brothers had arrived in Kentucky. The news spread beyond the borders into Tennessee. The citizens of both states were hysterical upon hearing the news. That anxiety spread like a virus to Ohio and South Carolina. Despite becoming household names, the Harps still managed to find victims. As they made their way up Marrowbone Creek, some 25 miles south of Colonel Trabue's home, they stopped at a cabin that belonged to John Graves, a farmer. They woke John and his 13-year-old son and asked if they could spend the night. John gave his consent. Both of the Graves could sense no danger in the Harp brothers. This is an account given of the fate that befell the Graves that night. Early in the morning, probably before the man and boy awoke, they, with Graves' own axe, split the heads of both open and threw the bodies of both into the brush fence that surrounded the house. There they lay until someone, seeing so many buzzards around, made an investigation and discovered what had taken place. Following this, the Harp clan migrated 20 miles north to Russell County. From there they went southwest of Green River to Mammoth Cave and Russellville. As they headed toward Logan County, they committed some more murders. The first of the victims of this killing spree was a slave. An account recorded of this murder at the time went as follows. They met with a Negro boy going to mill, dashed the boy's brains out against a tree, but left the horse and bag of grain untouched. The age of the victim invited no mercy whatsoever. This is an account regarding their murder of a little girl. One of their victims was a little girl found at some distance from her home, whose tender age and helplessness would have been protection against any but incarnate fiends. According to witnesses who had a look at her body, the Harps cut her entire body into 1-inch strips. 2 members of the Cherokee tribe joined the Harp party as they headed into Logan County. Just before dawn, the Harps and Confederate Cherokees attacked some campers who slept in a communal tent. There was only one survivor, who ran for help. When he returned to the campsite, he found his companions murdered and extensively mutilated. A rescue party helped dig graves for the victims. They also did what they could to get a sense of where the Harps were headed. The tracks they left behind indicated they were venturing southward in the direction of Tennessee. Logan County Sheriff William Stewart organized a posse of about a dozen men and sent them to the state line. They went in the wrong direction, however. The Harps devised a system to leave false tracks, and it worked. August 1799. The Harps stopped to water their horses about 3 miles northeast of Russellville. This site had gotten a lot of human traffic. It was the location of a legendary Presbyterian revival. It may have been considered hallowed ground by people of faith, but that meant nothing to the Harps. It became a battleground between good and evil as the Harps arrived with the shadow of the devil himself looming overhead. The Harp brothers felt no love toward anyone, not toward each other, not even their own children, which they only came to regard as a burden. They hated it when they cried. They were concerned that the so-called ballin' young'uns would capture the attention of a posse in pursuit of them. The brothers threatened to kill their children many times. The Harp women knew the brothers did not issue idle threats. Knowing their children were always in danger of being slaughtered by their own fathers, they would take them to a location far away from the camp at night, so that their fathers would not hear if they cried. Despite the mother's best efforts to protect their children, the unthinkable happened. This is the commonly accepted story of how it went down. Micaiah's daughter was hungry and began to cry. Her wailing infuriated Micaiah. He decided to shut her up. This is an account given at the time about what happened next. Big Harp snatched it, Susan's infant, about 9 months old, from its mother's arms, slung it by the heels against a large tree by the path side, and literally bursting its head into a dozen pieces, threw it from him as far as his great strength enabled him, into the woods. The baby's blood dripped down the ridges of a maple tree's bark, among the droplets of sap. Susan Harp was too intimidated by her husband to protest. Though they were aware that there was a statewide manhunt on their trail, it was not enough to intimidate the Harp brothers, and they continued to kill. They migrated toward West Tennessee. That is what was commonly believed at the time. In reality, they returned to Henderson County, Kentucky. They rented a cabin on a small farm adjacent to Canoe Creek. Their landlord was completely in the dark about the fact that they were the notorious Harp clan. This was decades before the invention of photography, after all. He was a bit put off by their filthy faces and the tattered rags they wore as clothing, but that was common among migrant families at the time. A man named John Slover encountered a clan he believed to be the Harps, and he reported their presence and what he considered to be a nearly fatal encounter to General Samuel Hopkins. A man named Trowbridge was en route to a farm to sell salt. He didn't return to his point of origin. Months later, one of the Harp women confessed to what she knew about Trowbridge's fate. The brothers ambushed him about 8 miles from the mouth of Highland Creek and killed him. Predictably, they cut open the man's chest cavity, filled it with stones, and tossed him in the stream. This time the victim's body remained at the bottom. Law enforcement stepped up their pursuit of the Harps, but the Harps always had associates who would tip them off when the heat was closing in. August 21st. Now that law enforcement had given up and called off their spies, the Harp clan left their cabin and rode south about 15 miles until they reached the home of James Tompkins at Deer Creek. They claimed to be men of God, and their host was the real McCoy. As a measure of unfathomably goodwill on McKay's part, he repaid Tompkins' hospitality by giving him a generous amount of gunpowder when he was told Tompkins had none and was therefore unable to hunt for meat. Tompkins' life was spared. The Harps even politely declined his offer to let them stay the night free of charge. They had an appointment elsewhere. Another man was marked for death. He was a farmer named Squire Silas McBee. He only lived a half-mile down the road from Tompkins. He was wealthy, politically connected, and a former soldier in the Revolutionary War. Long before the Harp brothers murdered for vengeance and sport, McBee endeavored to murder the Harps' people and drive them out of their homes. It was their intention to not only murder McBee, but tear his body to pieces. Fallen game suffered a more merciful fate than what the Harp brothers had in store for McBee. The way they saw it, his mutilated body would send a message to anybody who was pursuing them. They would make an example of him. They arrived at the McBee property in the early evening hours. The residents were already in bed, sound asleep. The Harp brothers were cautious as they approached the house, but they were unprepared for the ferocious hound dogs that McBee kept for hunting and security. When the dogs sniffed the foreign presence of the Harps, they attacked. The Harps were not able to prepare their rifles in time, and they were left with no alternative but to fight the dogs with their bare hands. The commotion woke McBee, and he went to the door to see what was happening. Normally he would have called off the dogs, but he intuited that their victims were up to no good, so he left the dogs to their devices. The dogs made short work of the Harp brothers, and they were forced to retreat. The Harp brothers rode 4 miles to the cabin of Moses Stiegel. They knew who lived there. One of Stiegel's roommates, Esau Sellers, owed Susan Harp $1, and it was repaid. August 21st. Moses Stiegel was away, but his wife Mary and their 4-month-old son James were home. A surveyor named Major William Love had visited the house to see Moses about a business matter. When he told her he was exhausted from the journey to the house, she allowed him to spend the night in the house's loft. Before long, the Harps rode up. When they arrived, Love climbed down the ladder from the loft and greeted them with her. The Stiegels had once lived in Knox County, Tennessee, and they knew the Harps well. The Harps requested that she refrain from addressing them by their real names in the company of those who were strangers to the Harps. Mary introduced Major Love to the Harps by one of their aliases. The Harps asked if they could spend the night at the Stiegel home. Mary told them the only surplus of space existed in the loft, and that they would have to share it with Major Love. The Harps didn't complain about the cramped quarters, but there was one factor of sleeping in the same bed with Major Love they didn't care for: his loud snoring. One of them could not abide it after a while, and decided to silence the man. He took up his tomahawk and bludgeoned Love with it so hard it fractured the man's skull, and his brains squirted out onto the bed. By then the sight of blood and gore spilling out every which way did not disturb the Harps. Their women were also accustomed to it. They all slept soundly. In the morning, they complained to Mary about Love's snoring, but failed to mention that they murdered him in cold blood. They requested a hot breakfast. Mary agreed to cook it for them after she attended to her son, who was ailing. Dealing with their son's illness took a long time, and the Harps didn't appreciate having to wait so long. They offered to rock the baby in his crib as she prepared the meal. She agreed to delegate that part of the childcare duties as she cooked. Minutes later, the baby grew silent. Mary called the men to the table to have their breakfast. She was fascinated to know how the men placated her child so effectively, especially since he was sick. She went to the crib to check on little James. She would wish she hadn't. Mary screeched. She was so horrified by what she saw she collapsed to the floor. The Harps took one of Mary's butcher knives and plunged the blade into the baby, stabbing it to death. They grew frustrated with Mary's hysteria at seeing that her baby had been savagely murdered. They pulled the knives out of the crib and stabbed Mary several times. She fell to the floor again and bled out to her death. Having finished with this business, the Harps returned to the table and finished their meals. A man named Neville Lindsay recalled the grisly details of this murder. 3 case knives were stuck into the body of Mrs. Stiegel. One of them was buried in so deep that the fire which consumed the house would not burn the handle. Sure enough, after looting the house, the Harps set it on fire and rode away. 2 men named Hudgens and Gilmore were walking back home after obtaining a supply of salt. The Harps saw them coming and assumed the men saw them. Whether this was true or not, they ambushed them, brandishing their rifles. They accused them of murdering the Stiegel family and burning down the house. Naturally, Hudgens and Gilmore insisted they were innocent of the charge. They agreed to be taken into custody and taken to the McBee house, where they would prove they were inculpable. The Harps rode behind them. They didn't get far before Micaiah shot Gilmore in the head. Gilmore was dead before he hit the ground and landed face first. Hudgens tried to escape into the forest, but Wiley caught up with him and beat him to death about the head with the butt of his rifle, until the man's brains began to leak out. The Harps kept the men's dogs. They waited for Silas McBee to come along, but he never did. John Piles and 4 companions from Christian County, Kentucky, were returning from a trip to Robertson's Lick. It was a different path from the one at which the Harps were situated. When they investigated the Stiegel house fire, they had decided to go to the McBee residence to report it. They passed the Harps along the way. The Harps didn't react. They decided that if the men came back in the presence of McBee, they would ambush and murder all the men. When the Piles party notified McBee about the fire, he grabbed his gun, jumped on his horse, and rode to the house of one William Grissom. They headed toward the Stiegel cabin, but not on the same path where the Harp brothers were waiting. McBee asked Grissom to accompany him to the Stiegel house. Grissom reported to the house with several of his relatives. The bodies they found inside, charred by then, were buried outside. Having finished with that task, they rode back to McBee's house, once again avoiding the route where the Harp brothers awaited them. McBee formed a posse. The Harp brothers had to be found and taken out. It was long overdue. Moses Stiegel rode up. He was given the unfortunate news about his wife, child, and house. He was asked if he could ride to Robertson's Lick and round up some volunteers to join the posse. Stiegel was hell-bent on getting revenge against the Harps, so nobody had to twist his arm. He wanted to slaughter them by his own hand, but he was rational enough to realize that he could not kill them while outnumbered, so he agreed to join McBee's posse. All the volunteers vowed to die to bring about the demise of the Harp brothers, if necessary. The Harps waited until the afternoon before they abandoned their post. They went to the hideout where their wives and surviving children resided. Eventually they left and resumed their journey. The posse knew they were getting close to the Harps' location when they found the dead carcasses of their dogs. The Harps killed them because their barking threatened to give away their location. It was August and in the middle of a heat wave. If the dogs had been left for a long time, their decaying flesh would have permeated the air with a powerful stench by then. The dogs hadn't even begun to swell, indicating that the Harps weren't far away. McBee's own understanding of animals was such that if they sought the Harps on horseback, the horses' noises would alert the men to their presence. They pursued them on foot. They didn't find them, so he ordered his men to mount their horses to cover as much territory as possible. The Harps had been very lucky up until this day. With a combination of providence and well-placed contacts, they usually remained one step ahead of the law. This was the end of the line. McBee and his posse hit pay dirt. They saw the Harps' quarry on a hillside. The Harps were in the company of another man. They all held rifles. Micaiah held a horse's bridle, but Wiley was without a horse. Not only did McBee not know who the third man was, but he was also unaware that he stood between the Harps and the grave when they decided to murder their women and children. Micaiah was in a hurry to leave. He wanted to move to territory where the law was not pursuing them. He told Wiley and their women that he intended to kill the babies and discard their bodies. He wanted to get rid of anything he felt would slow them down. He was the alpha male of the group, so everybody agreed to sacrifice the children for what they perceived to be the greater good. Well, Sally Harpe wasn't on board with this idea. There was no way she could submit her child to slaughter as if it were livestock. She took the baby to an area beside a small stream. She placed them under a shelving rock, which shielded the infant from view. She decided that if this plan did not succeed, she would gladly die for the child. Eventually, Wiley approached her. He said it was time to kill the baby. Before he could do anything, he saw that a man named George Smith was approaching. Smith was a horse hunter. He rounded up stray and wild horses and sold them. Wiley alerted Micaiah to his presence. Micaiah rode to where the other men stood. Minutes later, the posse arrived. McBee grew excited when he saw the Harps. He shouted, "There they are!" The Harps attempted to escape. Micaiah rode off on his horse. Wiley took off on foot in the opposite direction. Though the man standing with the Harps upon McBee's arrival was not in cahoots with the Harps, McBee suspected him as much and shot him. The man sustained serious but not life-threatening injuries. Moses Stiegel recognized the man as George Smith and alerted McBee, who spared the man's life. George Smith knew he would have been a goner if the McBee party, as his deus ex machina, had not arrived in time. Micaiah knew he could not return to camp. His concern was that the McBee party had likely gone there by now and were poised to ambush him. Everybody in Tennessee and Kentucky were howling for the Harp's blood, so he couldn't afford to be so rash. The Harp women and their children remained at the camp, where they were safe from both the McBee posse and the Harp brothers. When the posse approached the camp, they found that the only adult present was Sally Harp. She told McBee that Micaiah had departed moments ago with his wives. She didn't hesitate to tell McBee the direction in which Micaiah was headed. McBee's posse rode in that direction, but they did not find Micaiah. They assumed Sally deceived them to save Micaiah some time. They went back to the camp. McBee pointed his gun at Sally's head and informed her that if she didn't tell him where Micaiah was really headed, he would decorate the camp with her brains. She insisted she wasn't lying and pointed in the same direction once again. McBee and the posse could sense the integrity in her voice, and they embarked on their pursuit of Micaiah once again. McBee put Sally on his horse, determined that she too would be brought to justice. 2 miles from the camp, the posse saw Micaiah Harp and his wives on a ridge a short distance away. One member of the McBee party shouted out to Micaiah, ordering him to stop and surrender. Harp refused this order. He spurred his horse and rode away, abandoning the women to the same fate that befell Sally. Micaiah made a mad dash to escape. John Leeper fired in Harp's direction, but missed. The Harp women were arrested. They rode with James Tompkins and Neville Lindsay. John Leeper, Matthew Christian, William Grissom, and Moses Stiegel chased after Micaiah Harp. Harp rode as fast as he could, but he couldn't shake the McBee posse. Christian, Stiegel, and Grissom shot at him. Christian landed a hit on him, hitting him in the leg. Wounded, unable to outrun his pursuers, and his rifle in need of reloading, only one last desperate act could save him, though it was far from guaranteed. Leeper had ridden ahead of the others. Harp noticed this and decided to bluff him. He assumed Leeper's weapon must also be empty. Harp stopped his horse, dismounted, and turned back to Leeper. He primed his rifle. His design was to reload the rifle and shoot before Leeper could get to him. It had rained at night, and the water left Leeper's gunpowder wet. Due to this, the rifle was inoperable. Leeper was the best marksman of the group, while Tompkins was the worst. They traded rifles that morning. Not only had this event tilted the scales in Leeper's favor, but the gunpowder Micaiah gave Tompkins also left him at a disadvantage since he was running low. Leeper fired and hit Harp in the middle of his back, near his spine. Harper did not go down. He lifted his gun and pulled the trigger. When he did, little more happened than a clicking sound. For the time, at least, his rifle was a dud. He drew his tomahawk, even though the McBee posse were too far away to suffer its effects. Christian rode up, followed closely by Stiegel and Grissom. This was not a fair fight, so Harp mounted his horse, who was hot, thirsty, and exhausted. Leeper and Christian caught up with him. They yelled out to him to stop. Harp responded by shaking his tomahawk threateningly. He shouted back that if they stopped their horses, he would surrender. They were happy to put an end to the pursuit, so they stopped the horses and dismounted. They knew they couldn't trust Harp, however, so they loaded their weapons. Sure enough, Harp threw his tomahawk at Leeper. He jumped on his horse and rode away. Leeper's horse was spooked when the tomahawk flew past it. It ran toward Harp. Christian hopped on his horse and caught Leeper's animal. He brought it back to Christian. They resumed their pursuit of Harp without reloading their rifles. Harp's horse was walking slowly, exhausted. Harp had lost so much blood from the gunshot wound, he was struggling to summon up the strength to remain in the saddle. Finally, he fell to the ground. Resistance was futile. The McBee party surrounded the fallen murderer. He had long ago forfeited his right to mercy, but he nevertheless begged for a drink of water. Perhaps motivated by a drive to prove he was the better man, Leeper removed one of Harp's moccasins, took it to Pond River, filled it with water, and brought it back to Harpe, who drank it desperately. Though they wanted to watch the wretch die, McBee at least prolonged the point at which they could do so. He informed Harpe that his survival was not assured, and one member of the posse would escort him to the gates of hell. McBee searched his soul for whatever remained of the Christian compassion he felt for the man. He gave Harpe the opportunity to make preparation for another world. Harpe wasn't concerned about such consequences, so he didn't respond. Micaiah didn't want to talk to his wife Susan directly. He asked Christian to bring her to him so he could tell her he, quote, wished her to do better in the future, end quote. He also said he wanted to, quote, acquaint her with one last thing that was hid, end quote. He did not intimate of what this consisted. It was rumored that they stashed 2 saddlebags of gold in the woods adjacent to Pond River. It was plausible since they did rob many of their victims post-mortem. The gold was never found. Speculation had it that Harpe made this claim to buy him time. Christian would not bring Susan to Micaiah. She was a long distance away, detained by Tompkins and Lindsay. Moses was impatient to spill Micaiah Harpe's blood. He pulled his knife from its belt sheath. He waved the blade in Harpe's face. Stiegel stated his intention was to decapitate him as vengeance for the murder of his wife and son. Harpe was lying on his side, marinating in a pool of his own blood. He said to Stiegel, "I am but a young man, but young as I am, I feel the death damp upon my brow." In hopes of prolonging his death, Harpe confessed to some of the murders. He described in graphic detail between 20 and 30 of the killings. It was, of course, much less than his total body count. The only murder he regretted was that of his daughter. His voice grew fainter. He tried the tack of blame shifting. "Before I die, I could wish that old Baldwin might be brought here, as he is the man who instigated me to the commission of all my crimes." Baldwin had already been brought to trial, but there was insufficient evidence to convict, so he was acquitted. Stiegel couldn't wait any longer. He didn't want to give Micaiah Harpe the luxury of dying on his own time. It was a luxury Harpe stole from Mary and James. Stiegel put his gun at Harpe's head and took aim. Harpe wasn't willing to die by anyone else's hand. He bobbed his head from side to side. Since Stiegel could not land a headshot, he said to McBee, "Very well, I believe I will not upon reflection shoot him in the head, for I want to preserve that as a trophy." Stiegel shot Harpe in his left side. Harpe was silent as what remained of his blood poured out in torrents to the ground. Seconds later, Micaiah Harpe was dead. Stiegel pulled out his knife and grabbed a hold of Harpe's greasy hair. With his other hand he severed Harpe's head. After admiring his trophy for a moment, he held it aloft for the others to see. McBee emptied one of his saddlebags so Stiegel could put Harpe's head in it for storage until he got home. Victorious, McBee's posse rode away from the scene. Harpe's body was left behind to be picked apart by animal predation. When the Harpe women were informed of Micaiah's execution, they reacted with indifference. At one point, Stiegel forced Micaiah's wife Susan to carry the head. She carried it in hand like it was an Easter basket. She muttered, "Damn this head," throughout the journey. When they arrived at Robertson's Lick, Micaiah's severed head was displayed to the townsfolk. This was done to demonstrate to outlaws what they could expect as their fate should they commit the same atrocities as the Harpe brothers. The head was posted for all to see and remained in a public spot. There it remained years later, long after it withered into a skull. The spot where it was placed came to be known as Harpe's Head. Eventually the traffic thoroughfare came to be christened Harpe's Head Road. September 4th, 1799. The Harp women stood before the Court of Quarter in Henderson County. They were charged with being parties in the murder of Mary Stegall, James Stegall, an infant, and William Love at the house of Moses Stegall in this county, and in burning his house and robbing and stealing the horses, goods, and effects of the said Moses Stegall on the night of the 20th day of August last. The women pleaded not guilty. They were given an opportunity to defend themselves. They denied any wrongdoing, though they didn't give any evidence to substantiate their status as innocent. The judges had the women and their babies transported to a jail at Russellville. Their trial was set for October 28th. A description of the women at the time they were remanded to jail. They were coarse, sunburnt, and wretchedly attired. They were also infested with lice. One Sheriff Stewart described Susan Harpe thusly: she was rather tall, raw-boned, dark hair and eyes, and rather ugly. Betsy was profiled as rather handsome, light hair and blue eyes, and a perfect contrast to her sister. Sally was detailed as really pretty and delicate. The women's ages were undetermined. Many death threats were uttered against the Harpe women, and the sheriff took them seriously. One day, in the middle of the night, he moved them to a cave outside of town. October 28th, the day of the Harpe women's trial. They said the brothers, quote, declared war against all mankind, and determined to murder and rob until they were killed, unquote. There was no evidence to prove this claim, because the Harpe brothers were murdering long before they were incarcerated. The three women were said to have ridden a so-called hurricane of all horrors. This idea received a great deal of criticism in the 1800s. Their association and former loyalty to the Harpe brothers tainted their reputations irrevocably. They were nevertheless released from jail. Betsy was relieved to be unshackled from Micaiah Harpe. She was freed up to marry John Huffsetter when he proposed. Susan Harpe did not remarry. She raised the daughter of Sally Harpe on her own. The girl was named Lovey, and she inherited her father's temper. She was violent, but not homicidal. Nevertheless, she and her mother were forced to leave Russellville because of Lovey's antisocial behavior. The McBee posse never looked for Wiley Harp. His future didn't exactly look bright. If he wasn't gunned down or arrested, he would likely suffer from living in permanent exile. Wiley approached Samuel Mason, the self-proclaimed king of the river pirates, and asked if he could join his band. Up until then, he participated in some robberies, so he was as experienced as Mason would have wanted. Wiley had married and announced they would move to North Carolina. However, Wiley saw eastern Tennessee as his home. Moving there wouldn't be a smart move, since he was one of the most notorious criminals in the South. They wound up at the North Fork of the Holston River in Hawkins County, Tennessee. He happened upon a group of slaves who were working on a farm. He told them his wife was thrown from her horse and was killed as she was dragged from the beast. He ordered the slaves to bury her. They complied. He went into town, sold her belongings, and rode away. The woman's body was exhumed since Wiley Harp's explanation about her death sounded fishy. They discovered she died from traumatic blows to the head. Wiley fled westward. After living in Louisiana for a time, he moved to Memphis, which was called Chickasaw Bluffs at the time. He decided to earn an honest living for once, and he enlisted in the military under a pseudonym. His ruthlessness was rewarded this time. At one point he borrowed his captain's rifle, and after filling a canoe with survival provisions, he deserted and was never seen by the military again. Wiley floated down the Mississippi until he arrived at the Arkansas River. This was when he joined with Samuel Mason's gang. Eventually, the government became determined to put a stop to their activity. Governor William Charles Cole Claiborne declared, "These men must be arrested. The honor of our country, the interest of society, and the feelings of humanity proclaim that it is time to stop their career." He further said that the militia volunteers were to, quote, "use all means to arrest them or any of them." The army also agreed to track the party down. Claiborne promised a very generous reward for taking these lawless men. At one point, the reward was increased to $2,000, or $44,603 $2021. This would not be easy. Lawlessness on the Mississippi River was hardly uncommon in those days. Wiley also wasn't stupid enough to fill the chest cavities of murder victims. That would make it far too obvious who was responsible. He was the most notorious criminal in the United States, so he had to remain incognito. Nevertheless, their robberies and murders continued for some time unabated, and they were as savage as ever. They went on throughout 1802 and 1803. The law finally caught up with Samuel Mason and his ragtag coterie of pirates. They were hauled into court to face the music. Wiley Harp took measures to ensure his true identity would not be revealed. He used the alias John Seton. He portrayed himself as a victim of Masons. He also didn't hesitate to rat on his friend when he knew it might result in an acquittal or lenient sentence. He had constructed an ersatz biography for John Seton, which consisted of, among other things, that he was from Ireland and didn't even begin life in America until 1797. He claimed to have served in the military and worked in New Orleans as a carpenter. He was asked if he had ever known the Harp brothers. He conceded to having had some limited contact, but also limited knowledge of the brothers' criminal history. Wiley Harp avoided prosecution during this trial. He was arrested again and escaped. He was soon recaptured, tried, and sentenced to be hanged. Wiley Harp was hung in January 1804. His head was cut off and placed on a stake. The stake was planted along the Natchez Trace. The stake was elevated high enough to be noticed by all passers-by. It was always intended to be a warning to other outlaws. Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.